It was September 20th, 1911, and RMS Olympic, the largest ocean liner in the world, was leaving on its fifth voyage between Southampton and New York City when it was struck in the side by the Royal Navy protected cruiser HMS Hawke. Despite the severity of the collision, not only did neither vessel sink, but nobody was killed, and yet the accident had long-term ramifications that deserve to be remembered. The Olympic class of ocean liners, built for the White Star Line, three liners built between 1908 and 1914, were the result of a competition among liners of the era. The White Star shipping line had been founded in 1845, and by the last decades of the 19th century had risen to be one of the premier shipping companies in the world. Its two liners, RMS Teutonic and Majestic, launched in 1889 and 1890, had been state-of-the-art vessels built for speedy Atlantic crossings. In April of 1902, the line was purchased by a trust under the control of American financier John Pierpont Morgan. White Star, being owned by an American company, represented a threat to British supremacy with ocean liners, and in response, the British government offered loans and a subsidy to rival Cunard lines to build two new liners, RMS Mauretania and Lusitania, both of which were larger and faster than the aging Teutonic and Majestic. The chairman of White Star, J. Bruce Ismay, and Morgan then decided that rather than compete on speed, they would build three new liners that would surpass all competition in size and luxury. The Olympic class, built by the Belfast firm of Harland and Wolff, were truly massive, the largest liners in the world, 300 feet longer than Teutonic and Majestic, which they replaced, and nearly 100 feet longer than Mauretania. Among the many innovative features of the Olympic class were safety features, notably the inclusion of 16 watertight compartments that were thought to virtually eliminate the possibility of the ship's sinking. Olympic was launched in October 1910 and finished in May 1911. Her sister Titanic launched in May. Olympic's maiden voyage would commence on June 14th. And as she left Belfast for Southampton, the Vancouver, British Columbia world raved. It is the initial trip of the largest of all steamships, and as a consequence is attracting much attention in maritime circles. Among her special features are squash and racket courts, gymnasium, swimming tank, and Turkish bath. She will have accommodation for 600 first, 500 second, and 1,200 steerage passengers. Along with Titanic, the world continued, the two sea monsters, each 45,000 tons register, 882.5 feet long and 91.5 feet broad, boast the distinction of being the largest and finest vessels in the world. Her captain on the maiden voyage was one of White Star's most veteran and famous, Edwin Smith. The Edgar class of protected cruisers were authorized by the Naval Defense Act of 1889, intended for better performance than the disappointing vessels of the Blake class. The vessels were reduced in size as the Blake class had failed to meet expectations in terms of speed and endurance. Intended to be able to safeguard colonial trade routes, the class performed well, demonstrating better endurance and seaworthiness than the Blake class. The Edgar class were large cruisers, considered first-class cruisers, mounting 9.2-inch main guns. As protected cruisers, they had an internal protective deck of 5 inches steel and, common to vessels of the late 19th century, had an inverted bow, meaning the farthest point was not at the top but at the bottom. This design was intended to improve hydrodynamic drag, but also gave the ship a sharp ram prow, as ramming was still seen as a viable attack method. Although capital ships, they were much smaller than the superliners. Hawke was 378.5 feet long and displaced just 7,700 tons to Olympic's more than 52,000-ton displacement. HMS Hawke was the second of the 9 Edgar-class cruisers launched in March 1891. The ship served in the Mediterranean and in South Africa before being assigned to the home fleet in 1907. By then, the role of protected cruisers had largely been supplanted by battle cruisers, but the protected cruisers were retained, as battle cruisers were seen to be too expensive to be used for reconnaissance. On September 20th, 1911, Olympic and Hawke were traveling parallel to each other through the Solent, the approximately 20-mile-long strait between mainland Great Britain and the Isle of Wight. The Olympic, still under the command of Smith, was carrying, the New York Times reported, the largest first-class passenger list in Atlantic records, including 60 American millionaires. Among them was William Waldorf Astor, scion of the Astor family. The Pittsburgh Press reported that of the Olympic's passengers, an enormous majority were returning American visitors to Europe. Not only were there throngs of them aboard from London and other English cities, but from all over Europe, tourists had been gathering at Southampton to take the world's largest vessel to the home country. Hawke was under the command of Commander William Frederick Blunt, who, while a veteran destroyer captain, had only commanded Hawke since April. Olympic, coming from Southampton, encountered Hawke just as it turned from the Channel into the Solent. The New York Times reported that the weather was clear except for a light, drizzling rain. Among the passengers aboard Olympic was a U.S. naval officer, Lieutenant W.C. Nixon, who described the position of the vessels. Hawke, coming up the Channel from the Solent, about the same distance from the intersection as the Olympic, and rather more than that from the Olympic herself. The lieutenant noted that the Olympic had just blown 2 blasts from its whistle, indicating its turn into the Solent. He estimated Olympic speed at least 15 and probably near 18 knots. The lieutenant was concerned, but while yet a quarter-mile away, however, the Hawke slowed, leading Nixon to believe that the danger of collision was gone. He passed for a few minutes to the port side, and returning was surprised to find the Hawke coming up fast on a parallel course, perhaps 100 to 200 yards from the Olympic. Another Olympic passenger, magazine publisher Frank Munsey, one of those American millionaires, told the New York Times, "It was about 12:30, and while I was in the Ritz restaurant, that someone told me a big cruiser was running alongside the Olympic. I left the table and went to the window, and there I saw the Hawke running parallel with us. I watched her for a minute or two. We were just past the Cowes, a British seaport on the Isle of Wight." Unconcerned, Munsey went back to finish his lunch. But Nixon realized the danger, having attended a lecture delivered before the School of Marine Engineering by Mr. Sidney A. Reeve on the hydraulic interaction between ships. As the Hawke approached, Nixon noted, "It was nearly that instant when Mr. Reeve mentions that a shear out can be expected on the passing ship. And within a few seconds later I saw what I thought was this shear out." This, Nixon understood, was a sign that the Hawke was caught by the suction effect of the larger vessel that Reeve had described in his lecture. He wrote, "I remarked to a person to whom I was talking, 'We will be hit in a minute.'" Reuben Speed, a Cowes boatman who happened to be nearby, told the Times that he also thought the vessels were going to collide, although a companion thought the Hawke was going to pass beneath the Olympic's stern. But Speed was correct. Just at that moment, he told the Times, "The Hawke hit the Olympic a tremendous blow, so it looked to us, on the starboard side." Nixon recalled, a few seconds afterwards, the Hawke swung almost instantly, pivoting apparently on her center, and seemed to leap out of the water towards the Olympic. She struck the Olympic almost exactly at right angles, at a point about 75 feet forward of the Olympic's stern. Munsey simply recalled, "I went back to finish luncheon, and in less than 2 minutes felt a tremendous wrenching of the ship, which sounded as if it had struck a rock." Naval historian Joshua Allen Milford writes, "The Navy cruiser, HMS Hawke, suddenly rams her on the starboard side, just beneath the aft well deck, close to the stern. Hawke thrust 8 feet into Olympic's hull, tearing a 40-foot gash below the waterline. This caused 2 of her compartments to flood and twisted the starboard propeller shaft." Speed told the Times, after the collision, the Hawke dragged her nose, which was very badly smashed alongside of the liner, and her ram may have damaged the propeller. The Olympic reeled over a bit. Then we saw that a tremendous great hole, 15 feet wide at least, was just abaft the mainmast. Nixon reported no effort by the Olympic to maneuver, but opined, "I doubt greatly that anyone on the Olympic's bridge had the slightest warning of the collision until the instant of actual impact. View aft from the Olympic's bridge is not good, and her officers must have been busy with their navigation down the channel." Still, other theories were advanced, including that the Hawke's steering gear may have failed, or that the Hawke had been trying to get under Olympic's stern and the maneuver had failed. Hawke was described as having taken more damage. The Times reported that the Hawke is badly damaged about the upper part of the bows, and her plates are torn to the water's edge. But her bulkheads remain secure, and she is in no danger. The press reported that Captain Smith had the passengers of the Olympic lined up on deck, lifeboats and rafts manned, but determined that there was no possibility of loss of life. After a rapid survey of the damage in company with his chief officer, they report, Smith decided that he could bring the ship, passengers and cargo, back to port unhurt. Some early reports suggested that Smith had grounded Olympic, but those proved to be incorrect. Despite the damage to both vessels, there were no injuries or death. The Guardian reported somewhat cheekily the next day, "The Olympic Hawke collision, by which some thousands of persons were yesterday imperiled, has, thanks to the excellence of modern naval architecture, not cost the life of a single millionaire, And the $500 million worth of humanity on board the Olympic, or such at least was the lightning calculation of a smart news agency, escaped undepreciated. The largest difficulty, papers reported, was finding a ticket home, it being high season and most other vessels having already sold out. Initial reports suggested the fault lay with Hawke, which had, after all, rammed into the side of Olympic. Nixon noted that Hawke, being in all respects an overtaking ship under the rules of the road. In general, it is the responsibility of the overtaking ship to maintain sufficient distance. The Guardian was somewhat less charitable. It is not unusual for British men of war to blunder in broad daylight into other ships, least of all one whose size is comparable to that of a considerable tract of the country. But in a hearing before Sir Samuel Evans, president of the Probate, Divorce, and Admiralty Division of the High Court, in December, Evans decided that the Olympic alone was to blame, a decision which was upheld on appeal. The determination was that the Olympic and Hawke were crossing vessels, and that the Hawke was not, as Nixon had said, an overtaking vessel. Thus it was the responsibility of Olympic to keep out of the way, as Olympic was starboard of Hawke. However, at the time, Olympic was under the direction of a pilot, which was compulsory, and thus the officers of Olympic were not responsible for the damage either. Or, in other words, neither side received any compensatory damages. The decision was, however, very costly for the White Star Line, who was left both with the cost of repairing the damage and the legal bills, as well as missing out on the fares for the time the ship needed to be repaired. To facilitate repairs as soon as possible, parts of the Titanic, including a propeller shaft, had to be used, delaying the completion of Titanic. While the Olympic was found to be at fault for being too close, the cause was generally accepted to have been, as Nixon surmised, suction. While the Times reported that the theory of suction was discredited by the liner's passengers, who say that Olympic was not going fast enough to create any considerable suction, a December 1911 edition of Scientific American agreed with Nixon's conclusion that it had. Their assessment was based on the trials the U.S. Navy had done after the near collision of the German steamship Princess Eileen and the steamer Parima. The Olympic is a vessel of 45,000 tons displacement, while the Hawke is about 1/6 as large and of much lighter draft. It is easy to understand how the cruiser would be drawn towards a liner under these circumstances, and even though the commander of the Hawke did throw his helm over, the hydrostatic energy at work would be more than the latter's rudder could offset within the time available, especially if the warship was making considerable speed. Even the Guardian agreed. The accounts of the collision indicate that the Hawke, steaming parallel to the Olympic and having apparently slowed down to let her pass ahead, suddenly turned towards her and crashed into her quarter. This is exactly what one would expect to happen if she'd been caught by the rush of water settling in to replace the Olympic as she passed. And it is quite conceivable that this influence might be felt at a much greater distance from the liner than the navigating officer of the cruiser reckoned on. While some saw the accident as evidence that the superliners were simply too large, they seemed to take greater evidence from the way the Olympic survived, the ram from a warship whose prow was designed to sink other vessels. Popular Mechanics magazine wrote in December 1911, "In the first place, the lesson has been learned of the necessity of maintaining a safe distance between two vessels of such unequal size. But," they continue, "there is a certain compensating value in the feeling of security which the ocean traveler will feel, for the ship was able the following day to proceed under her own steam to Belfast. That is, the survival of Olympic might have reinforced the idea of unsinkability of the superliners, which may have contributed to the loss of Titanic the following April." One bit is telling. When Titanic did leave on her maiden voyage, on April 10, 1912, the same suction effect that had drawn in HMS Hawke caused the American liner SS New York in Southampton to pull free from its moorings and nearly strike the Titanic before it even made it out of the harbor, although the quick action of harbor tugs prevented a collision. Curiously, Titanic was under the command of Captain Smith, who had been the captain of Olympic, and piloted by George Boyer, who had been the pilot at the time of the collision with HMS Hawke. Olympic continued in service for another 25 years, including serving with the Royal Navy during the Great War, where, ironic given that she had been rammed by HMS Hawke, she rammed and sank the German submarine U-103. She traveled across the Atlantic so much that she earned the nickname Old Reliable, but fell victim to the decrease in transatlantic travel that came with the Great Depression. She was decommissioned and scrapped in 1935. Despite her age, HMS Hawke was also repaired and served during the Great War. She was sunk by the German submarine U-9 in October of 1914. The collision between Olympic and Hawke has given rise to a conspiracy theory since, which in brief argues that it was Olympic and not Titanic that sank in April of 1912. This theory posits that Olympic was switched for Titanic as part of an insurance scheme, arguing that Olympic was in fact too damaged for repair and thus was deliberately sent to sink for the insurance money, while Titanic operated on as the Olympic. While still popular online, there's a mountain of evidence against this switch conspiracy, according to Titanic historian J. Kent Layden. Notably, the Associated Press reported in 2023, each had a distinct construction identification number, also known as a yard number, that appeared on many of their parts, including their wood paneling. It is well documented that the Olympic's yard number was 400, while the Titanic's was 401. Multiple artifacts bearing the number 401 have been raised from Titanic, and items auctioned off after the Olympic was retired in 1935 feature the number 400. But there is the interesting question of what might have happened if this accident didn't occur at all, because one implication is that Titanic almost certainly would have had her maiden voyage in 1911, and thus might have avoided the fate that she faced in April of 1912. If Olympic had not had her accident, Titanic might not have had hers. And if neither accident occurred, would either of these vessels be remembered today, or might they both just be nearly forgotten history? I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.